What was the earliest church understanding of the word salvation? How widespread was this early view, and how long did it continue?
The earliest Christians didn't ordinarily think of salvation as simply having their sins legally forgiven so their souls could go to heaven after death. Forgiveness was essential, as were judgment and reconciliation with God, but salvation meant something much larger. It was God's rescue and restoration of human beings from everything that had enslaved, corrupted, and damaged them. This included rescue from sin, estrangement from God, death, bodily corruption, the power of the devil, and the disordered desires rooted within human nature. Salvation's goal wasn't merely escape from punishment, it was resurrection, incorruptible life, restoration to God's image, adoption into God's family, union with Christ, and participation in the life of God. A Christian living around AD 150 might have put it this way: salvation is God's rescue and restoration of the whole human person, from sin, death, corruption, and the powers of evil through incorporation into Christ, leading finally to holiness, resurrection, and immortal communion with God. That's broader than the meaning many modern Christians have inherited. The English word salvation didn't exist during the New Testament period. The Greek noun sōtēria meant rescue, deliverance, safety, or preservation, while the related verb sōzō could mean to save, rescue, heal, or make well. To the earliest Christians, salvation didn't sound like a narrow theological term meaning qualification for heaven. It sounded more like rescue from a deadly condition and restoration to safety and health. The Old Testament background was equally concrete. God saved Israel by delivering them from slavery, danger, and death. The Exodus became a central picture of salvation, and early Christians saw Jesus as accomplishing a deeper exodus from sin, death, and evil. The same connection appears when Jesus tells the woman who'd suffered from bleeding, "Your faith has made you well." The Greek verb is sōzō, which can also mean, "Your faith has saved you." The New Testament also speaks of salvation in the past, present, and future. Believers have been saved, they're being saved, and they will be saved. This doesn't mean salvation is earned by human effort or that Christ's work was incomplete. It means God's rescue was decisively begun through Christ, continues to transform believers now with their cooperation, and will be completed in resurrection and the final restoration of creation. Salvation included forgiveness and reconciliation, but also liberation from sin, death, and the devil. It meant healing and transformation, as the damaged person was restored and gradually conformed to Christ. It also meant participation. Christians received the Holy Spirit, became members of Christ's body, and shared by grace in God's holiness and life. Complete salvation required bodily resurrection. Death itself had to be defeated. We can see this broad understanding in the earliest Christian writers after the New Testament. Ignatius of Antioch, writing early in the 2nd century, described the Eucharist as the medicine of immortality and an antidote against death. Whatever someone might think of his sacramental language, his view of salvation is clear. Christ had come to cure humanity's mortality and bring human beings into immortal life. Irenaeus of Lyons, writing later in the 2nd century, offered one of the earliest extensive explanations of salvation. His characteristic idea is often called recapitulation. Christ, the second Adam, takes up the whole human story, succeeds where Adam failed, and restores humanity from within. Jesus didn't simply surrender his life so he could be punished in humanity's place. His incarnation, obedient life, suffering, death, and resurrection formed one saving movement. By genuinely becoming human, Christ joined humanity to himself, reversed Adam's disobedience, and led human nature toward incorruption, maturity, and communion with God. For Irenaeus, salvation was rescue from sin, corruption, and death, but it was also restoration to life, divine likeness, and fellowship with God. It wasn't merely a change in God's attitude toward human beings. It was the restoration of human beings through union with Christ. This participatory understanding would later be described with words such as deification or theosis. These terms can sound alarming to modern Western ears, but early Christians didn't mean that humans become God by nature or cease to be creatures. They meant that those united to Christ are enabled by grace to share in God's life, holiness, immortality, and communion. Athanasius, writing in the 4th century, described humanity's basic problem as corruption and death. The eternal Word assumed mortal human nature, entered death, and defeated it through resurrection. Salvation was the restoration of human beings to incorruption and divine life. Gregory of Nazianzus expressed the same principle when he said that what Christ hasn't assumed, he hasn't healed. Christ had to assume the whole human condition because the whole person needed healing. Because the whole person had been damaged, the whole person had to be restored. How widespread was this understanding? It was extremely widespread. Although it wasn't expressed through one single formula, early Christians spoke of ransom, liberation, victory over death and the devil, sacrifice, cleansing, forgiveness, justification, reconciliation, adoption, healing, new birth, union with Christ, and participation in God. Modern Christians sometimes treat these as competing theories, as though we've got to choose one and reject the others. The early church didn't. A writer might use legal language about forgiveness in one passage, medical language about healing in another, and military language about Christ's victory in a third. These were different ways of describing the same vast saving work of God. This understanding appeared throughout the ancient Christian world, from Syria and Rome to Gaul, Alexandria and Asia Minor. Western writers tended to use legal concepts more heavily, while Eastern writers emphasized healing, incorruption, and participation in God, but both traditions drew from the same scriptures and used a range of images. The Nicene Creed says Christ became human for us and for our salvation, but doesn't define one exclusive mechanism explaining how salvation works. The early creeds affirm the saving events, the incarnation, Christ's suffering and death, his resurrection and ascension, the coming of the Spirit, the resurrection of the dead, and the life of the world to come. The saving facts were more universally agreed upon than any single theory explaining them. This broad understanding remained deeply embedded through the first 5 centuries and continued from the 6th through the 11th. It would be misleading to say every Christian held one pure theory, now called Christus Victor, but victory, healing, ransom, resurrection, and participation remained central themes. A significant shift in Western emphasis came near the end of the 11th century with Anselm of Canterbury. Anselm explained Christ's work largely in terms of humanity's debt of honor to God. Sin had dishonored God, humanity couldn't make adequate satisfaction, and Christ offered the obedience and honor humanity owed, but couldn't provide. Anselm didn't invent satisfaction language or teach later penal substitution exactly as it developed, but his work changed the center of gravity in Western thinking toward legal and debt-related categories. During the Protestant Reformation, parts of Western Christianity placed still more emphasis on the courtroom. God's law had been broken, humanity stood guilty before the divine judge, Christ bore judgment on behalf of sinners, and his righteousness was credited to those who trusted him. These ideas drew from genuine biblical themes, especially Paul's teaching about justification. The important change was one of emphasis and comprehensiveness. In many Protestant settings, the legal element gradually became almost the complete definition of salvation. Healing, transformation, victory, union with Christ, participation and resurrection were placed under separate headings, such as sanctification and glorification. This can create the impression that salvation itself means legal forgiveness, while everything else is secondary. That isn't how the earliest Christians organized these ideas. For them, forgiveness was one indispensable part of a much greater rescue and restoration. Did this older understanding disappear? No, it remains explicit in Eastern Orthodoxy's emphasis on healing, liberation from death, and theosis. It also survives in Roman Catholic teaching on grace, sanctification, and communion with God, and in Protestant teaching on union with Christ, regeneration, sanctification, and new creation. The early vision wasn't completely replaced so much as divided among separate doctrinal categories, while justification and forgiveness came to dominate the word salvation. The most important contrast, then, isn't that early Christians believed in transformation while later Christians believed in forgiveness. The early church certainly believed in forgiveness, sacrifice, judgment, and grace. The real contrast is that it regarded forgiveness as one essential part of a much larger salvation. Salvation meant that God wasn't merely choosing to regard a guilty person differently. Through Christ and the Holy Spirit, the person was actually being brought from death into life, corruption into incorruption, slavery into freedom, alienation into communion, and finally, from the grave into bodily resurrection. That was the earliest Christian understanding of salvation, and for many centuries, it remained the broad framework through which Christians understood the entire saving work of God.